Ben Flivberg and Dan Gardner published a book in 2023 all about estimating costs of large projects called How Big Things Get Done. But as I was reading this book, I realized that one of the authors, Dan Gardner, actually co-authored a book with Philip Tedlock called Super Forecasting, which was actually a New York Times bestseller back in 2015, focused on the art and science of prediction, again, these themes on estimating. Now, it gets even crazier because Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, who's basically the godfather of behavioral economics, references Ben's large project database about halfway through the book when he's talking about the planning fallacy. So if you liked super forecasting or Thinking Fast and Slow, then I think this book should be next on your list. Now, in this video, I'm going to be breaking down the 5 lessons that we can learn from some of the biggest and largest construction estimating or cost failures. Now, before we dive deeper into the lessons we can learn, I do want to take a look at one of the author's large database of projects as referenced in Thinking Fast and Slow. This database includes 16,000 projects across 20 different fields and across 136 different countries. Now, this is the graphic that he shared in his book, and it's to show basically across all the projects what statistically has happened. And so you can see, he calls this the iron law of project management, and it shows that only 8.5% of the projects that he looked at were on budget and on time, which would be like the schedule aspect of the project. What's even crazier is that only 0.5%, so less than 1% of the projects were on budget, on time, and on benefits. So the whole purpose of the project itself. So it should be no surprise when we hear about projects like the Sydney Opera House, which was estimated to be about $7 million, but then it was actually $102 million when it was finally completed. And that's 1,400% over budget. That's an insane number. Or more recently, California's high-speed rail project, which was estimated to be about $23 billion. And now a lot of studies are coming out, and a lot of reports are coming out saying it's $128 billion, which again is a huge number, and that's 500% of an over-budget number. So why are we so off? Why are we hundreds of percents off the initial estimate? Why are we that wrong? Well, let me tell you what typically happens. And the authors hint about this in their book, which made me feel very validated from what I see from a construction standpoint. Someone in an estimating department or pre-construction department throws together a budget number, usually a mashup of past project data. They then give this number to a project manager who then typically says, I can't sell this. There's no way, it's too high. Now, emphasis on the word sell, because they're going to sell this number to upper management. So they cut it. They cut as much as they can until they feel intuitively that they can sell this to upper management. Then the project team uses that number to measure everything against. And then they start experiencing schedule delays, and they usually break the budget very early on. So then somebody in upper management sends a team to go digging, go investigate, figure out what is driving costs to go up so high. But no one ever looks at the initial estimate to see if the benchmarks were even realistic. They ignore that completely. It never occurs to us that the real source of the problem isn't the budget overruns or the immense amount of costs that you're now spending. It's actually just an unrealistic estimate. So we are measuring ourselves against a number that wasn't even realistic or accurate to begin with. And this is one of the many reasons you see these projects go massively over budget. And this brings me to my favorite quote of the book, which is, if people knew the real cost from the start, nothing would ever be approved. So how can we do better in the future? How do we avoid these massive overruns and cost breaks? Well, the author suggests that if you want to come up with an estimate for a project, you need to use an anchor and adjustment technique. This is nothing new. Use an anchor number and adjust from there. It's not rocket science. He calls this reference class forecasting, and you take the best anchor you could find, and then you rarely adjust. So that's the key, that you rarely adjust, and you need a very good anchor number. So how do we find this good anchor number? Well, we have to get better data. One of the points he makes in the book, and something I completely agree with, is old project data is not really considered valuable enough to collect, so you don't see a lot of people going back and pulling data from past projects. Project managers and executives are so focused on that next project that they just don't think it's relevant enough to pull from the old project because it's over. We're on to the new shiny project. Let's focus on that. So then nobody really goes back and pulls everything and gathers it in a nice clean way. And then time goes on and you forget what estimates were done. You never go back and check the estimate from what the actual project finalized as and compared how well you did because you're too busy focusing on the estimate for the next project. And as a data scientist working in the construction industry, this drives me absolutely nuts because my job is literally to predict the most accurate costs for construction projects. Now, it's not enough just to collect good data. You actually need to have a fundamental basic understanding of distribution curves, especially if you want to use them to predict future costs. The biggest misconception when it comes to cost prediction is thinking that everything is a normal distribution. This is what I mean by normal distribution. You have a very even looking curve, your tails are super tiny, look how thin they are, and you have what's called a regression to the mean. A regression to the mean means that observations tend to move back to the mean or average of a sample. So if a contractor has an unusually large kitchen renovation, then all things being equal, the next renovation should go back towards the average or mean. So therefore it would be cheaper. And then same thing, vice versa. If it's also a really cheap project, your next project, all other things being equal, will navigate back towards the average. But in this book, the author argues that complex systems like construction, manufacturing, those types of things end up having what's called a fat tail distribution. And I pulled this graph from Super Forecasting. It shows it the best that I could find. I tried to find one on the internet, looked better, but this is the best one, straight from Super Forecasting. This is what a fat tail distribution, and you can compare it to this normal. This is the fat tail. Notice how this tail is unusually large compared to this little baby tail over here. That's the difference. So this is kind of to show the difference between a normal and a fat tail distribution. When I say construction has a fat tail distribution, I'm saying that you will have far more extreme outcomes as compared to a normal distribution. You have much more likelihood your projects will be on the extreme ends of cost overruns or high budgets or just cost in general. So if your project does go wrong, you have a higher probability of hitting these extreme numbers. And with these fat tail distributions, there is no regression to the mean because the mean is no longer a good representation of this distribution. So you have what the authors called regression to the tail, which would be somewhere around here, right? The fat tail. So it's no longer going to the average overall, it's going to the tail, which again will be higher on the higher side. So if you use a normal distribution when you're supposed to be using fat tailed, you're going to predict things that are much less likely to happen and cheaper when it should be a little bit larger. So really your first question you should be thinking about is, do I have a fat tail distribution or not? Now, lucky for you, I took a snip of this and this shows which types of projects have fatter tails versus non-fat tails. So if you look here, if you're gonna do a road project or anything like that, like wind, solar, thermal, energy transmission, right? You're less likely to have fat tails, but if you're in a more complex environment project like nuclear powered, nuclear storage, or in my case, I'm in the advanced manufacturing division or the semiconductor division, which deals with lots of chemicals on lots of complex systems, you're most likely going to be in this fat-tailed distribution area. Now, in the appendix of his book, he actually shows a bunch of data across those 16,000 projects that he evaluated or looked at. And so I recreated the chart to make it look nicer so we can investigate a couple of these. So if we look at just buildings here, he's saying these projects were on average 62% over budget. But even knowing that, and even if you factored in the fact that you would potentially be 62% over budget, you aren't going to be as covered as you think because you're not on a normal distribution curve. Because if you look at this next column, 39% of those projects went disastrously wrong. And what they're coining as disastrously is 50% over budget or more. So 39% of the projects were over 50% over budget. So 39% of the projects went disastrously wrong, which is that over 50% over budget or more, right? Of those projects, if you take the average over budget cost, right, it is 206% over budget on average for the projects that went really, really wrong. Now that's nowhere near the 62%, right? Like we're shown that the average overall is 62%. Why are if you take just 39% of the projects and you take the average of those, why is it so much higher than that 62%? 206% is a lot higher than 62. And that's again, because this is not a normal distribution. The mean, the average, isn't a great indicator of what you're going to see, right? And that's the key, because this isn't a normal distribution, this is a fat-tailed distribution. You can have far extreme outcomes. So again, how confident are you in your project? If you take a look at some of these names, right, like nuclear power or IT projects, right, you're looking at 447% if your project goes disastrously wrong, right? So it's a bet on, do you think your project's gonna go disastrously wrong? If it does, you have a huge spread, right? You're seeing something somewhere 447%, 200%, 200%. Like none of these are nice, kind numbers, okay? So again, how confident are you in your project? How different is your project, right? Because sometimes you tend to tell yourself, hey, my project's different. Okay, what does the data tell us though? Okay, so we understand we need to collect high quality data, and we need to understand what your distribution is, what prediction model you want to go with. Is that it? Is that all we need to do? The answer is no. We actually have a series of cognitive biases that will impair our ability to make decisions on these large projects. The first one is the commitment fallacy. We have this tendency to rush to commitment. So it sounds really nice. Like when somebody says like stern, makes a decision super fast and quick, they are actually stereotypically seen as being very like leader. Look at that leader, so decisive, but you actually aren't considering all your options when you rush to make a decision. You don't explore alternatives, you don't look at risks, you don't plan for those risks because you never considered them in the first place, and that's just not going to help your project in the long run. So keep that in mind, because we do, as humans, have a tendency to just rush to a commitment. So keep that in mind, know that you're doing that when you think, oh, I just want to get it over with, I just want to make a decision. Just, take a step back and think about if you're doing a shallow analysis or if you're doing a deep analysis on your project. Next, we have the planning fallacy, which is my personal favorite. It's when we underestimate the amount of time and effort a project takes, even when we're shown data suggesting that we are underestimating things. We even will come up with these false narratives thinking, oh, my project is different, and yeah, that project failed, but it was completely different than the project I'm doing now, and that is not good for decision making. The author talks about how people in power, typically executives, find that planning is almost a wasted effort, especially when you're under a time pressure. Now, a way to get out of that mindset is actually to do a pre-mortem, which is where you say, hey, my project went horrifically wrong. What happened? You almost think about, okay, let's say 10 months from now, the project is buried in change orders or whatever. What was it? What caused all the cost runs? What caused the schedule delays? And you start thinking about all the risks, and you'll come up with a way better analysis and risk up front before your project actually hits that milestone. Finally, we have the sunk cost fallacy, which is where you continue to sink time and effort into a project even when it's not going very well. Now, this is a natural tendency, right? This is just something like innately human. When we invest something, we want to invest more just to, save face. Especially when you've put in time and effort, you're like, hey, I already put stuff in, I might as well throw some more stuff in. And that's a terrible way to make decisions. They've proven it over and over again. This is in almost every psychology book that I found. And a good example of this in like a personal life is when you start watching a movie, 20 minutes in, it's terrible, but you want to finish the movie. So it's like sunk cost fallacy at play. Same thing when you're reading a book. You're 20 minutes in, it's terrible, but you don't want to stop because you already invested 20 minutes of your time into it. It's just a bit more dangerous when you're handling multi-million-dollar projects. Hopefully this gave you an exhaustive amount of information when it comes to predicting costs of large construction projects. Now you can expand on this topic because we're talking about very upstream issues, and there's actually a book called Upstream, which I highly recommend. I don't think it gets enough clout for how good that book is on how to solve problems before they become problems down the road. So check that out. I will link it up here. Otherwise, I will see you guys next time.